Welcome, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. My name is Dmitry Grozbinski, and I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session and to the opening of Geneva Trade Week 2023. This is, in fact, our fourth Geneva Trade Week. And as always, we have tried to put together a program that hopefully enhances and deepens your experience, whether you're attending the WTO Public Forum in person or trying to catch as many of the sessions as you can online. We encourage you to check out the rest of our agenda. And for those of you in Geneva, we hope to see you at the 3 receptions we are hosting this week. Geneva Trade Week is a huge amount of work to put together. If you want to appreciate exactly how much work, my mother, and I swear this is true, upon seeing a photo of me recently, sent me a picture and a link to shampoo that gets rid of gray hair with the caption, "Just for information." Most of the hard work actually doesn't fall on me. It falls on our fantastic team led by our head of events, Juanita Calabala, who has put everything you see here together. And we are immensely well supported by colleagues from other organizations, including, of course, TESS, which has put together today's session. Today's agenda specifically will begin with the TESS event, and I am going to read this because our TESS colleagues love a long title. The role of trade and trade policy in advancing action on the SDGs, how to boost coherence and cooperation. After that session, we will have a short half-an-hour coffee break while we reset the room, and then we'll settle into a more informal fireside chat co-hosted with the platform on thinking ahead on societal change and the International Geneva platform on global health. Where we will discuss some of the practical aspects of how to get these 3 policy communities that obviously have a lot in common and a lot of areas that interconnect to work together, to talk to each other more, and to understand one another's worlds. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce this particular session, put together by our TESS colleagues. Incubating and supporting the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs has been one of the things we are proudest of having been able to do at the Geneva Trade Platform. TESS really needs no introduction, but I will introduce it anyway. It is an organization of phenomenal energy that is all about supporting and enhancing the work of the trade, environment, and sustainable development communities. It is at the heart of so many of the conversations here in Geneva around trade and environment, and it really does excel in that role of ensuring that the delegates and member-led processes are supported and given the resources that they need to further enhance their important work. TESS is, of course, led by its superlative founder, Caroline Dierberg-Beck, and nothing would have given me more pleasure than to invite her to take the reins of this session. Unfortunately, as some of you may know, she has been unavoidably called back to Australia by a personal tragedy. She is in our thoughts, and we hope she is in yours. We wish her all the very, very best. But for today's session, we are thankfully in the incredibly good hands of Alice Tipping from IISD. Alice and IISD have been phenomenal supporters of Geneva Trade Week, the Geneva Trade Platform, and TESS, really from our first days as respective organizations. And Alice also happens to be the best moderator in Geneva. So she is one of the few people I would trust to wrangle a panel with 6 excellencies. So with no further ado than that, let me please pass the floor to our moderator for today, Alice. Excellencies and the excellent Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Dimitri. And welcome everyone to this opening plenary of Geneva Trade Week. I am honored and delighted to be here. As Dimitri says, I only wish it was under happier circumstances. And as he has said, Carolyn and her family are absolutely in our thoughts, and we hope we'll see her back here soon. So the session that TESS has put together today is a fantastic one to open Geneva Trade Week, right? Because I think it puts front and center some of the really important decisions that are facing the trade policy community and the international development community in Geneva. I'll introduce our panel in just a second, but just to give you kind of a sense of what this conversation is designed to deliver. So the purpose essentially today is to bring together senior leaders from across International Geneva, and we have 6 ambassadors seated here. We have 3 senior representatives from international organizations who will come up next. And the idea essentially is to give them the chance to offer their perspectives on how trade and trade policy are relevant to efforts to advance the implementation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a fantastic and really interesting topic for me, because back when the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed back in 2015, I, as a naive little policy officer, wrote a really nice paper with an institutionalist expert on the WTO about the role of trade and the role of trade organizations in supporting the SDGs and in monitoring them and delivering them. And we presented this paper in this building to a group of WTO ambassadors and international organization experts. And the response from them back in 2016, apart from one, was generally, this isn't us. The SDGs are a New York thing. That's a UN thing. That has nothing to do with us. 2016. It is a relief, and I have to say, a relief on many levels, to see how far the discussion has shifted. I mean, revolutionarily shifted. And I think it's also been quite a change for the trade policy community, of which I consider myself part, generally quite a technocratic, somewhat insular policy community that's more used to negotiating tariff lines next to the lake than it is to thinking about trade and labor and the oceans and health. And now that is exactly what the trade policy community is in the middle of doing. And I think it's a huge challenge, but one that the trade community is meeting. So we're here to talk about connecting the dots between the range of actors that are relevant to trade and the SDG agenda in Geneva's multilateral setting, and it's a very unique multilateral setting. So to link the processes underway in New York with what's going on here, and to talk about trade, not for trade's sake any longer, but to talk about trade and the supportive role that trade and trade policy need to make in delivering on much greater ambitions, ending hunger, conserving life underwater, right? Ensuring that the planet and that the climate are stable and livable for future generations. And that's a tall order, right? Because it requires not just thinking about trade in a much broader context, but it also requires the kind of integration that we're going to be talking about a little bit today, in particular from the organizations based here in Geneva. So I will introduce briefly our panel of distinguished ambassadors. They will each have 5 to 7 minutes to give us their perspectives on the role of trade in delivering on the SDGs. When they're finished, I will ask them all to exit stage right down those stairs and take a place reserved from them in the front row. And I'll then ask our 3 IO representatives to come up and sit just between me and the podium. So starting from my left, we have Ambassador Matthew Wilson, the permanent representative of Barbados to the WTO. We have Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, the permanent representative of Brazil to the WTO. Ambassador José Valencia, the permanent representative of Ecuador to the WTO. Ambassador Usha Dwarka-Kanabadi, permanent representative of Mauritius to the WTO. Ambassador Pim Chamok Pitfield, the ambassador of Thailand to the WTO. And Ambassador Simon Manley, the permanent representative of the UK to the WTO and to the UN, actually. 2 hats. So the questions put to each of these ambassadors have been drafted, knowing ambassadors to be nice and general. I have had a quick double check with almost all of them, and there are specific things that I might ask each of them to speak to. I'll start with you, Ambassador Wilson, because I think understanding the role that trade needs to play probably involves, as we were talking about just before, a couple of steps. Deconstructing perhaps the challenge before us, and then reconstructing perhaps our vision of what trade needs to be contributing to this broader debate. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for having a small developing country here. So as a true young ambassador, I'm going to ignore the questions that were posed and just talk about what I feel I want others to hear. So I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic, a little bit realistic, but hopefully end with some solutions. I want to talk about COVID first. For me, the COVID period was the perfect counterfactual for how the absence of predictable trade impacts on the progress on SDGs. COVID for me was the most devastatingly interesting lab to look at the relationship between open trade and the SDGs. It really is such a fascinating conundrum, and it shows that we really shouldn't speak in black or white. For me, black and white are the rules, but I prefer to live in the gray. And a lot of economists and lawyers don't like to live in the gray, but I like to live in the gray because sometimes it's in the gray that the principles exist. And we already have the principles, which are the SDGs. And we need to then focus and remind ourselves of these principles and then take a look again at the rules and the regulations and the cooperation practices that meet or do not meet these principles. Because I find that far too often we like to start the other way around. We have the rules, which are, and let's be honest, likely crafted by the powerful for the powerful. And then we try to find a way to retrofit these rules into global principles that we have all agreed to. So what can we do? I don't think we can wait to 2030 to do this assessment, which is why I'm really happy that the SDG Summit is happening in a couple of days. I'm really happy that we have this drive to this so-called SDG stimulus, which I think is really important as well. But then we have to base this reassessment on some facts. And the fact is that the financing gap to implement the SDGs in developing countries has increased by 56% since COVID. And more than 4 years of progress in terms of poverty alleviation has been lost in the past 4 years. And if you look at the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index 2023, 1.1 billion people live in acute multidimensional poverty across 110 countries, and 165 million people fell into poverty between 2020 and 2023. So what do we need to do? What do we need to look at before we start to link trade and the SDGs a little bit closer? First of all, financing is critical. A lot of people don't like to talk about money, but this is really, really critical. So we need more and we need better ODA and aid for trade. We need more innovative schemes, we need more private sector financing, and we need to unlock climate finance in the multilateral development banks. And this is what Barbados has been pushing through the Bridgetown Initiative. Come to the public forum on Wednesday and attend our session because we'll have the architect of the Bridgetown Initiative, Professor Prasad, there. Debt is a huge problem. I just saw a working paper released by the Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery Project, and it said that sub-Saharan Africa countries face debt servicing costs, which are nearly the same as their climate finance needs. How on earth could that be logical? Human rights, gender equality, rights of minority populations, migrant issues, these continue to be under severe attack in the UN system and in the global system. And on the multilateral rule system, I think that we can also be honest and say that it has probably been underperforming in terms of making new rules, but I will hasten to say it has not been underperforming in terms of the issues, the breadth of issues being discussed in the WTO right now. This whole idea of WTO reform, I think, is very important, but it has to be WTO reform, not just for the WTO, it has to also be WTO reform for delivering for the SDGs. CO2 emissions, we know what needs to be done. We saw what happened during COVID. We know what needs to be done. We just need to now provide some of these solutions around some of the new challenges like carbon emissions or the flow of green technology and how to address key supply chains in solar panels and electrical vehicles, which are very, very heavily concentrated. The digital divide, far too wide. We know this. And let's not even talk about look at the electricity divide. In sub-Saharan Africa, 600 million people don't have access to electricity, far less talking about access to the internet. And then finally, we need to look at productive capacity. We have to make trade happen, not just make trade possible. If you look at the SDG indicators around LDC trade growth, they have decelerated in the last couple of years. And frankly, only in exceptional cases before the pandemic did we even really see progress on the LDC indicators. And I think that's something that we need to really address. And I could go on, but the problems are never in doubt. It's really easy to point out the problems. The question is, how do we develop a system of shared but differentiated responsibility? And we haven't yet sorted that out. Any reasonable person in this room would say that if least developed countries produce less than 4% of global CO2 emissions, but have suffered almost 70% of deaths caused by climate disasters since 1972, then surely common but differentiated responsibility must be a new global principle, including in the WTO. Any rational person here would say that if all Caribbean SIDS together account for under 0.5% of global fishing catch, they should not have the same responsibilities and the same restrictions of those that produce 10, 20, 30%. Any logical person would say that if 2/3 of the poor now live in middle-income countries, how on earth could you graduate middle-income countries out of accessing concessional financing and grant financing from the multilateral development banks? But sometimes rationality seems to leave global policy-making positions from the minute that we enter a room together. I don't know why. Why is this? I think there's a lack of real accountability, both in the UN agencies and in the WTO. And I think we have to find a way to regain that. And part of that is being more intentional about how we link the trade discussions that we have here with the UN discussions around SDGs in New York. And I'll come to that a bit later. Thanks.
Super, very, very interesting. And I think this question of accountability is changing significantly, right? And as you were saying, one thing that having worked in or around the WTO for a number of years, I can see is, as you say, the variety of discussions that are now going on in the WTO building is huge, right, compared to where they were 10 years ago, right? We have 3 different environment initiatives. A couple of them have 4 working groups each. There's a huge range of discussions going on that frankly never were in the past. The challenge, I think, is now turning those discussions into outcomes and progress, and that'll be interesting to see. Ambassador Patriota, if I'm not wrong, this is not your first time in Geneva, so you might also be able to speak to what you've seen change since the last time and where we are now. Go ahead, please.
Well, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks to Cez for this invitation. A lot has changed, as you have mentioned yourself. I was also Brazil's negotiator for the SDGs in 2014, 2015, so that was part of my portfolio, and I can completely concur with you that in those days, there was a feeling that discussions on sustainable development were not really a matter of concern for the people doing the technical stuff here in WTO, which was a more concrete, more organization that had stronger commitments that dealt with the real economically relevant issues globally and that had teeth. But now the teeth have fallen off your institution. And I think it's an institution that, to my surprise, is now struggling to find a way forward beyond the current impasse, and a kind of feeling that some of the founding members of WTO have in some way lost interest or turned their backs to the institution to a certain degree. And there's a threat that they might be falling back into a kind of inward-looking attitude towards their own development. So we're kind of left out in the cold. Before, WTO was an organization seen as a rich man's club, and developing countries had to fight for their voices to be heard and to gain a little bit of influence in the design of these treaties. Now we're fighting to sustain the organization, to make it strong again, to make it relevant again. And it's seen as the lesser evil, in fact, maintaining WTO fully functional than simply not having it as the hub for global trade anymore. So those are the challenges we're facing today, and that aspect of the situation has completely turned around since my last turn of duty here. I left in 2008. That was when we almost reached an agreement to the Doha round. The July package, it failed by a small margin, at least that was the impression. Now, I think the SDGs to me are a fantastic set of goals and a platform for all countries and all stakeholders to embrace. Most everything that you read in there is positive and good. So it's a bit of the good governance platform, and it includes a kind of a more holistic integrated view for the future because it treats economic development, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion on an equal footing and as intertwined and interrelated aspects of the same thing. And trade in there appears mostly in Goal 17, so it shows up as a means of implementation. So the idea is that trade should provide the means for all, in particular developing countries, to profit from trade in a way that will generate resources for them to achieve those goals. So we need, in fact, more trade, we need freer trade, and we need fairer trade that will accommodate the position and the different levels of development of all countries that are members of this institution. So there's the issue of development very clearly set. What I see now is that sustainability has a big issue here in the WTO, but perhaps not always in the positive sense that it was incorporated in the SDGs as part of these three pronged objectives of sustainability, social inclusion, and economic development. So I think we have to find a better integration between the platforms. The idea of the WTO should be doing what it's supposed to do, which is to provide more trade, not less, and provide global rules and not fragmented into the world in which different blocks turn inwards and put their shoulders back to the again. That will not help. That will not provide the means of implementation for developing countries to have enough resources, or at least some resources, to implement the ambitious goals of the SDGs. And I think we should also have in mind that in the 2030 development agenda, there's a recognition that development at least a certain level of development comes first. So it's other things. I think you need poverty eradication, you need to eliminate hunger, you need to educate people, you need water and sanitation for all these basic needs, which is kind of almost like human rights type of aspiration. They need to come first. So I think you cannot jeopardize these human rights by leapfrogging towards other goals which are also essential, such as environmental sustainability. But you have to do this tandem. It has to be together, integrated, not leave people hungry and try to protect forests. You need to get them to eat while protecting forests. And finally, the word that trade for Brazil is incredibly important. And we have developed since the early days of WTO now into a huge exporter of food and grains. So we've become a very efficient agricultural producer. And that's an area where the WTO has not delivered. So still, there's a pending issue of fully incorporating the agricultural sector, the food sector, into the multilateral trading system of rules towards more open global markets, not global markets. And if people are now concerned with food security and sustainable production of food, meat, grains, I think we have to accept that some countries are more efficient in that production. Brazil and the Latin American region overall are becoming huge providers, suppliers of food. So we're part of the solution to food security. We're part of the solution even to sustainable agricultural means of production, not the problem. And we're facing more and more in certain central markets that are also large producers but are great subsidizers. We're facing some difficult access challenges based on environmental concerns, but we have to look closely at those measures because the measures are taking under an environmental protection narrative, but in fact they appear to be mostly, or the impact is that they are actually very distorted and restrictive trade measures more than being environmental measures. So we're facing also that challenge. It's a big one, but we're here to support the WTO. Not becoming great again, but at least functional again.
No, quite right. And I think that's a couple of fascinating things there. And the first that caught my attention was the role of developing countries now in fighting to maintain that system of global rules. I'm originally from New Zealand. We are a teeny tiny agricultural country in the corner of the Pacific Ocean, and smaller economies desperately need global rules because everyone is bigger than you. Brazil perhaps is a little different. But again, the focus on keeping the value of global rules and keeping those rules functioning and enabling them to be enforced, I think is a really interesting discussion that's going on in the WTO. You ended on the food security point, and I might perhaps then pivot precisely to you, Ambassador, because I think you wanted to speak exactly on food security, and the WTO has been trying to deliver rules and to deliver outcomes that support food security, and it's one of the, I think it's SDG number 2, so it's high on the priority list. But maybe can you give us your perspective on how well that's going? And I might turn to you next, Ambassador Kalabadi, to link back into the OSHA's questions. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tess, for the invitation today. I'm very honored. I go back even further back than Alice in addressing this issue of trade environment, because I started in 1993 with the dispute case on tuna dolphin. So I've been with this issue for for decades now. My impression, before I go on to talk about food security that you have invited, is that it is true, like Ambassador Wilson and Ambassador Patriota, which I have just met today, sorry, talk that maybe there are some kind of feeling in the WTO, a little bit ambivalent towards SDGs and what our goals are. But my impression is I'm a little bit more optimistic than Ambassador Wilson, because I feel that when I started this, there were perceptions and feelings that trade is obstacle, trade measures are obstacles to achieving sustainability. But I think the feeling and the impression has changed. Now we see more and more how trade measures, trade policy can support and be an enabler for achieving sustainability. So I am a little bit more optimistic on that point. Actually, I have prepared some points according to the suggestion, but I will start as Alice has suggested, that to me the priorities that I think trade policy and measures can support in SDG is about number 2, food security. And I'm speaking this as a representative from a developing country with actually we're not a big exporter of agriculture anymore, surprisingly, but we are number 1 exporter in several agricultural products. It means we export a lot of cars and electronic parts, which have a lot of value, but in terms of livelihood and importance to the population, it remains agriculture. So in Thailand now we are facing the impact of not only the COVID pandemic, we have still leftover impact. We have impact from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We have now facing greater challenges from the El Nino, which is taking a heavy toll in many agricultural producing countries, including Thailand. What we are facing now is that as a number 2 rice exporters in the world, in Thailand right now we are paying a lot of money to buy rice, which we produce, and this is because the supply in the world and domestic market have reduced rapidly due to El Nino and other factors. And this is where I think trade measures and trade policy could come in to address, because it is not only happening in Thailand. We have heard in India, in many other countries around the world, that the supply side of agriculture and food is being disrupted heavily in this year and next year. So in terms of export restriction measures or some kind of global value chain support, trade facilitation, even standard, I think these are all related to trade measures. And I hope that discussion in the WTO about food security and agriculture will continue to address this short-term you know. So there is these short-term challenges for SDG, meaning in food security, but then also there are other long-term challenges that trade measures should address as well. In the interest of time, I don't think I have much time left, but apart from food security, I want to mention about what I see as challenges in achieving SDGs that trade can help. I think in helping SMEs, this is one thing that I feel very passionate about, and also how to help many SMEs and small farmers transition in the energy and agriculture, which is the two main, you know, this is, I'm moving to the climate change issue, because for me, food security and then climate change is the second challenge. We know that number one, GHG production comes from energy. Second, in agriculture sector, and these two sectors are so important to Thailand at least. And I think that in Thailand, SMEs and small holding farmers need a lot of help in transitioning towards the achieving SDGs. And when we talk about this, it's not only access to finance, which I agree with Ambassador Wilson, but access to technology. I think this is a very great challenge that many developing countries, operators, businesses, even farmers, and even big businesses are facing. So I want to highlight all these issues, but I would like to end with what I see as you ask for political opportunities. I talk about challenges. I want to say that there is opportunities, because right now around the world we are alerted and we are embracing the kind of okay, this is the thing that this generation, we have to do it. You know, we have to address climate change issue. We have to address environmental challenges. I think the government, public sector, private sector, big and small, and especially the youth, the people, younger generation, they are very active. There's a gentleman smiling. I'm sure he's one of the youth movement. So I think, you know, we have to capitalize on the interest that the world is paying attention, and the world is alerted to how important climate change is, and try to band together and find the common solution to this. So there are things that we can benefit from. The final things that I want to leave is that despite all the common interests and attempt to try to address this issue, the challenge is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to achieve climate change in every country. Thailand, Mauritius, the United Kingdom are different from, let's say, if we talk to the Pacific Island countries, to African country. Brazil, the largest agricultural, one of the largest, sorry, producer in the world. So for me, that's the same goal, but the path towards that goal may be different. How are we going to find a common solution to achieve to that goal is a challenge, but I'm being hopeful. Thank you.
No, thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. And I think it's, as you pointed out, there are very immediate short-term challenges and conversations that need to happen at the international organizations here. That's their role. That's the role of the regular committees. And there are much longer-term challenges, right, about the nature of the longer-term cooperation, the financing, who does what, who bears the burden, who pays for it, and how we organize ourselves. And those are the longer-term discussions that also need to happen. Perhaps moving from land-based food security and rice to ocean-based food security, Ambassador. You and I have been working on fishery subsidies for a while now, but I wondered if you could speak to us about your perspective as a great ocean state with a very, very large EEZ, about the role of the trade community and trade policy measures in oceans and ocean-based food security. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm assuming this is on, right?
I think so. They will tell us if they can't hear you.
So
Maybe hold it slightly further.
But Alice, let me first of all thank Caroline for bringing us together today and remembering her in these difficult circumstances. And thank you also for moderating us today. I want to come back to your 2016 story.
Yes.
In 2016, when you told the story to the whole auditorium about we need to look at the environment and everything else, I'm not sure that anybody in the room was unconvinced, but I think as what happens all the time on WTO issues, the moment you bring something new in, the suspicion just grows. And they think, oh, this is one more condition. First labor, then animal welfare, and then this one. So nobody wants to listen to you anymore. It's true around the world, as Nana has just said, there is more sensitivity now. And I think you know that it's inevitable to have this discussion. You don't necessarily like the way it's going because you feel CBAM, for example, why is this coming my way? I really don't want this. But you still know that at some point you'll have to address it, whether in WTO or elsewhere, you'll have to address it. In any case, the EU is negotiating also with the ACP countries right now, different economic partnership agreements where they're bringing their own conditions on that one. So from this, let me just say a quick word about the direct link. I think there's always been a direct link between trade and SDGs, and many SDGs, the goals specifically refer to the multilateral trading system, and they refer to the conclusion of the Doha development round. And yet that's the conclusion that nobody wants to see right now. So we need to ask ourselves, why do we commit and then uncommit after some time? So zero hunger, SDG 2 is what Nan spoke about. And I think the surprising thing about this is that how can we not want to do anything about this? We knew we had to do the export subsidies. Nairobi did that. There's been progress on that. So why can't we make progress on other things? Are we going to wait till the cotton industry falls through in West Africa to make that happen? Or is it because the West Africans have no power? If I replace the countries of West Africa and this happened to China or India, would the reaction be the same? So the power struggle is also there, and it's very real on that one. But coming to fisheries, again, SDG 14, it's always struck me in WTO. When we talk about life underwater, people go around thinking more livelihoods. My little artisanal farmer and my little artisanal fisherman and the island states concerns. It's less about the marine ecosystem. But we know fisheries subsidies, overfishing, overcapacity, all of it is affecting the eco-marine system quite a lot. But we still don't want to get there. And my question to you is why? Oceans, 50% of oxygen, 25% of carbon dioxide absorption, and 90% of the excess heat that these emissions bring. So if we don't preserve them, what do we do? But that is divorced from the fisheries subsidies discussions going on somehow. The bigger picture isn't there. The picture is, can I have 0.5 de minimis or 0.8? No, please, 0.7%. No, I want 0.8. Can we get together as mature adults and have a conversation? I'll tell you why it's difficult. Because even now, everybody in this room needs no convincing that food security and fisheries are the topmost priorities. We need to get these by MC13. What do we have? We have Ukraine. We have what we call Epididamocles on our head telling us, food grains, maybe we'll renew it, maybe we won't renew it. We don't know. Fertilizers, maybe we'll let it come out of the port, maybe it won't come out of the port. We don't know. Then what do we have? We have the famous COVID-19 everybody spoke about. And I'm less concerned about what you mentioned, Ambassador, was the economic impact is there. The labor impact is there. We see how many people haven't rejoined the labor force, but the psyche generated by COVID, chacun pour soi. Look after yourself, forget others. We need to do this for ourselves, okay? That is still very, very present. Then you go to G20 and New Delhi. It was an amazing piece of work, the New Delhi Declaration, and it starts with this. Vasudev Kutumbakam, we are one family. We are one family, we are one earth, and we are one planet or one future, which is fine. And then further down, you start scrolling down, it says, well, there were diverse opinions on this one, on how sanctions should be implemented. Then it says, we see the link between trade and environment and the need for these to be mutually supportive. We commit strongly to accelerating to achieve the SDGs, but it doesn't say how. And then the last thing, a G20 declaration that is very good, says things we've heard before. And then we have the US elections coming up. So my question to you is this, it's not me answering questions. You tell me, when is that right moment that we're going to have? When everybody is less concerned about answering accountability to the people who vote for them, but answering to the world and what needs to be done for the world. This is why the United Nations was created. And I use this to share something about you. We're talking about 2016. I remember the story in my head. I was chairman of the subsidies committee many years ago. And then that was the first time Clarice was secretary to the committee. And that was the first time we got a request from a letter from NGOs and people saying they want to discuss fishery subsidies. So it was my last meeting. So I said, look, Clarice, put it under AOB. We'll see. Well, put it under any other business, and under any other business, because you can't take decisions there. All these hands shot up, Japan, Iceland, India, Rajesh Agarwal actually was now at ITC, and saying, why on earth did you do this, Chair? You have no right to put this. Somebody writes to you and you put this under AOB. And I said, well, you know, as your chair, I just felt I had to bring this to your attention. And I did this on purpose under any other business, simply to take note. You can't do anything. And I said, but if you tell me you don't even want to take note, I'll put a record on file to say that we did bring this to the attention and the following delegations objected to our taking note of this. So after that, it was very quiet, thank goodness. But just to tell you how difficult the progress in conversation is. Thank you.
Absolutely. Masterful chairing there. And isn't it ironic that what was any other business became the last multilateral outcome that we've had from the WTO, right? Still getting there, not finished yet, but still getting there. Ambassador Manley, I'm going to jump from you and then I'll jump to you, Ambassador Valencia. The general questions apply to you too, but I thought, if you don't mind, I'd refer to a roundtable that you and I both sat in last week, which you convened to talk about the UK's upcoming development strategy. And we had there not only representatives of the trade policy community, but representatives of the humanitarian and the development community. And it was a huge eye-opener for me to hear from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue in this building, from OHCHR, the human rights, the refugee agencies, the demining, the small arms survey, all of the organizations, many of them based here. And they talked about the realities of their work. And one gentleman from the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue said one of the real struggles they have is in getting their ceasefires that they broker to hold. Because, as one person, if I've remembered the quote correctly, said to him, I'm sorry, man, I can't eat peace. Which brings us to the role of trade and the broader development challenge. So maybe if I could take advantage, and I'm sorry, we didn't script this, but if I could take advantage of the fact that you're the UK's representative, not only to the WTO, but to the UN and that whole side of International Geneva, what links do you see as you sort of sit back and look at us all beavering away?
Right, I mean, it's a great.
Would you like to use your microphone just for the people online?
Sorry, the excellent Alice. Thank you.
hard
I'm still struggling with the notion of you as a, what did you say, a naive little policy officer? I can't believe that was ever true. Anyway, look, it's a great question. I eat almost everything. Yeah, you can't eat peace, right? But look, I think it's a really good point, because look, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and let me welcome, by the way, Ambassador Patriota back to Geneva. A man who plays such a pivotal role in creating these goals. They are holistic. Mm-hmm. And let's recognize that we were making progress, but that progress has been completely thrown off course. First, really by the pandemic. Second, by the ever-increasing pace of climate change. And third, coming to your point, by conflict. In this case, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has created such havoc on international food markets. So I do think you need to look at these things holistically. I do think also, and back to the fundamental point here, that we have to recognize that trade has been, can be, should be an enabler of getting us back on track on these Sustainable Development Goals. And, you know, we hope that the SDG Summit, that we do recommit to those goals, but also that we commit to the reforms that are necessary, including to the IFIs, including to the multilateral system, that will enable our work to bear fruit over the few years that we have left until 2030. And I absolutely agree with Ambassador Patriota that at the heart of that is fairer trade, freer trade, more open trade. And we all have a responsibility, but particularly those of us, frankly, in the developed world, to ensure that we keep our markets open, that we respect the rules of the WTO as we struggle to green our economies. It cannot be at the cost of developing country access to our markets, because fundamentally it won't work. It won't work. It won't work politically, and it won't work economically. This has to be a collaborative endeavor between the developed world and developing world within the multilateral system, including here in Geneva. And we need to think here in Geneva, outside of our silos, outside the WTO, outside even of UNCTAD, but bringing together our efforts right across this town to green the global economy, and to do so in a way that offers opportunities, not obstacles, to the countries of the developing world.
Fantastic. Very, very good. Thank you. Ambassador Valencia, we were going to ask you to talk about coordination, how this all comes together. I'm just looking at time, and just to let my other HE panelists know, I do have time to give you a little response, like 1 minute response to something that you've heard others say on the panel. And I know, Ambassador Wilson, I think you were going to say something more about accountability, if I'm not wrong. So if you'd like to come back to anything that you've heard the others say, you'll have 90 seconds or so to do that before I offer our international organizations the floor. Ambassador Valencia.
Okay.
Coordination, how do we pull this all together?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, how to boost coherence and cooperation, coordination that you are mentioning. I will start just recalling what you say, Alice, at the beginning of this meeting, when you said that, discussion or presentation of your paper and the reaction that you had at the time. We were on this common trauma, I should say. But what we see now is something that is quite different, and the presentation of the other ambassadors here are really talking about a real understanding of the necessity of dealing with SDGs here at the WTO, doing something about that. So I think that's a very good beginning. Just the beginning. We know pretty well that we still face challenges on that regard. Ambassador Wilson referred to some of them, some very specific issues that are there, and also the other colleagues that took the floor mentioned other problems that are still open and we need to tackle in our work. But then what we have here, we have the WTO. We know that it's a perfectly organization as any international organization is. We need to do something about using the tools that has the WTO available, but also having in mind the shortcomings or the limitations that the WTO has to do its job in general, but regarding the SDGs in particular. So briefly, I have some notes I have to adjust to what has been presented here. And first, certainly with this quite logical, I should say, we have to align the SDGs to the WTO agenda. It is not some sort of a legal binding mandate to do that alignment. For sure, all UN members adopted the SDGs. We know that it's not a legal binding instrument anyways. But at the same time, we have the commitments under the WTO that are more concerned with trade and trade, So how we are able to do in order to have the WTO agreements, legal framework to work for SDG, the SDGs, yes. How we can provide the WTO to be a useful tool, having in mind overcoming the limitations of the organization. That is, I believe, our strategic, if you want, challenge as an organization. We do have mandates at the WTO. We have the Marrakesh, we have the Doha round, as it was mentioned before. But then the how is now the real, challenge that we all have. I believe that perhaps we have two broad paths to follow. The first one is to try to implement the norms, the agreements already in place at WTO. Try to be creative trying to adapt them for the challenges that we have. I'm thinking now, for example, in plastic pollution, we may be able to use the already in place tools at the WTO to do something about that. Yeah. And the other path, huge, perhaps is even bigger than the first one, is to try to build new tools, new possibilities to attend the SDGs from the trade perspective. So to innovate, we cannot just say, I'm sorry, we have this legal agreement framework here, and we cannot do anything else because we are, an organization, a member-driven organization that we take decisions only by consensus. I mean, that's not really an answer, in my opinion. We have to try to, of course, follow the rules, but be more creative and more than creative. We have to be more assertive in adopting these new additionally paths or tools towards facilitating from the trade perspective the achievement of the SDGs. We have a very, very challenging agenda ahead of us. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues here had already said, but I should mention that the SDGs are not just a list of urgencies or agenda items that we have to do all together because they are all encompassing the developing challenges around the world, sustainable development challenges, because that agenda is a real global one. It does not concern just to developing nations or to ill disease, if you want to put some emphasis, special emphasis. It really concerns to the whole world. To the whole world. We all have something to do, developing and developed nations, and we must do it. Otherwise, we know perfectly the consequences, just not for developing nations, but for the whole international community, for the whole world, in fact. So that's probably my conclusion for the time being. I know that we don't have enough time and we have a lot of work to do, but more important, we have to start doing something back there over the lake, yes. Next to the lake. I mean, thank you so much.
No, quite right. And I think just to pick up on a couple of examples, right? I mean, one of the things that was really two things that were really revolutionary about the SDG framework, if you compare it to the Millennium Development Goals way back when, the SDG framework is for everyone. Everyone has to work towards these. It's not an agenda for developing countries that we have to help with, right? It's everyone's agenda, and it is integrated, as you were saying. And one of the things that I find really interesting about the new environment initiatives, including on plastics, and I know that Ecuador is playing a huge leadership role in the plastics initiative in the WTO, but also in the UN negotiations. And what I find very interesting about those initiatives is exactly as you've said, they give members an opportunity to think differently about what they want to use the WTO for. Not everything has to end up in a legally binding multilateral treaty. You could do other things, and these initiatives give you the chance to think about other ways of cooperating. Okay, we're almost at time. I'll give you the opportunity. You don't have to have your 60-second response or any last points you've forgotten to make, but if you'd like to make it, if you'd like 60 seconds, I'll give you 60 seconds each. Ambassador Wilson.
Okay. So,
45.
Yeah. So 5 things. One, and this is to the WTO Secretariat. You guys need to be more present in New York. The WTO Secretariat needs an office in New York because far too often the discussions in New York around the SDGs do not take on board trade issues enough. It's not enough to fly in once a year during the SDG summits to talk about trade. You need to be there, like UNCTAD has been, and they've done a great job to consistently feed the message on trade into the SDGs. We need a place here, a formal place here in Geneva to discuss the relationship between trade and SDGs, either in the CTD or a special session of the General Council that happens every quarter where we can discuss these issues because it's far too dispersed in the Geneva ecosystem. We need more participation in platforms in the WTO, like the MSMEs working group. We need more developing countries to be involved. The SDGs will not be achieved unless we look at how trade can positively impact on MSME growth. So we need to have more people involved in those discussions. Third, we need to continue to tackle some of the key issues, the tough issues on climate change. So there I applaud TESS, I applaud TESS-D, I applaud the plastics initiative, the fossil fuel subsidies reform. And we need to continue to look at issues like carbon border adjustment measures, because as Ambassador Manley was saying, we cannot have measures that work for the environment, but yet decimate MSME entrepreneurship. So we need to look at these things carefully and to ensure that the rollout is coordinated and that the priorities of developing country MSMEs that are part of the supply chain are taken on board. Fourth, we need to access new and emerging technology, especially know-how and green technology. And I really call on more developed countries to be more involved in the discussions in the WTO on trade and transfer of technology. And finally, fifth, we need to have some more integrity with how we approach these issues of agriculture policy and industrial policy especially. This is not our grandfather's WTO, you know? This is not our grandfather's world. So we need to approach it differently. We need to seriously look at what the ACP in particular have been calling for, to have another look at industrial subsidies to make sure that we can have them work for the green transition. So we need the WTO to also be flexible enough to say, okay, in 2023, the rules that we agreed to 20 years ago no longer work for us with what we need to do today. So we need to be brave and intentional about that. Thanks.
Fantastic. Ambassador Patriot.
Thanks. Yeah, okay. Well, there was a development deficit in the Uruguay round. That was the story that the Doha round was meant to sort of compensate for. We never finished that round. The SDGs in some respects does compensate for that development deficit because it's a platform for development, a very all-encompassing one. Of course, it involves, implicates all countries, developed and developing, as you mentioned, but it is geared towards those most in need. What I find very interesting is that Ambassador Manley's this statement is one that I could fully endorse and subscribe. And I really hope you say the same thing once we're in a green room situation. Because I can fully, there's a full meeting of minds here. The way he put it is how I would put it. And I find it very promising that at least in this environment today, we can all agree on everything that has been said, Ambassador Wilson as well. So I think we're at least looking in the same direction, all this. Thank you.
That's the way to start. Ambassador Valencia, anything specific?
Well, specifically, perhaps just to, in the 60 seconds now, 55, well, I believe that this discussion, as we can see, is a discussion that involves more than, the WTO members, I believe. It involves international community, international organizations, international civil society, or stakeholders, as they call it. And certainly we have to try to make it a very participatory, very transparent discussion, conversation. I think it will be helpful to do that because they will also give us that, feedback for us to work in the best possible way. Then it doesn't mean that we as WTO members and also the WTO Secretariat and civil society stakeholders, they have specific things to do on this matter. I cannot elaborate now because of the timing, but just to have in mind that this is a purpose that we all have to do something about it. We all have to show our commitment from the place where we are seated, and we have to do it certainly in a very expeditious way because in some of the issues related to the SDGs, time is running and we have to do something and do it pretty soon. Thank you.
And it requires a variety of actors to move it forward. Absolutely. Ambassador Kanabadi, anything to add?
Well, I think if we could find a way of compelling all governments to put together coordination committees that would bring together Ministry of Environment, Foreign Affairs, and Trade, so that they can start making compromises internally and finding decisions. In the absence of that, I'm going to put my money on voluntary carbon markets because I think that's the way to go.
Fantastic. Ambassador Pitfield?
Yes, thank you. Well, my theme has always been, SMEs, access to technology and that kind of stuff. My 60 seconds, which I've already used, is only one thing that it is time that we must make trade policy more climate friendly, more development friendly, and more SDG friendly. We don't have to do everything at the same time. We can think about win small but win often. So we have to identify areas that are important for each for members, and also try to do is a gradual approach, because if we are, of course, this is a big issue, but if we are too ambitious, try to do everything at once, I am not so sure we will be there in time, but we have to try to address these issues. So yeah, climate friendly trade policy measures, that is my one sense of thought.
And start with what is feasible.
We have to update. So update. I think there's room for improvement to update trade rules to be in line with what we need in this century.
And there'll be a lot of discussion, I think, at the public forum precisely about that. Ambassador Manley, last 60 seconds.
Thank you, Alice. So I think Usha said you can't avoid these debates because they're going to hit us whether we like them or not. I kind of got to go further. I think we have to embrace these debates about trade and sustainability, and we have to embrace them as part of that recommitting to the goals, as part of that reform of the architecture to enable those goals, and as a part of our efforts to accelerate our efforts right across the piece, because trade can, should, must play a positive role if we are to actually ensure that we avoid the worst of climate change and ensure that that process delivers for developing and developed countries.
Fantastic. A great point to end on. That does bring us to the end of this first session. I've let it stretch out a little bit because I know there was a little bit more value to drag out of our ambassadors. Excellencies, thank you very much indeed for joining us all. I will invite you to exit stage right over there. And I will invite our 3 international organization representatives to join me from the left. So your stairs are over there. Not at all. Go ahead. Yep. So you're welcome to join me. So these faces will be very familiar to many of you in the audience, but coming up first is Mr. Aiko Lim, who's the Director of the Environment Division at the World Trade Organization. Yes, you can sit here. Ms. Miho Shirotori, the Director AI of the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD, just here in the middle. Perfect. And no, just over here, just next to the perfect. And Mr. Sang-Hyun Lee, who is the Director of the Employment Policy Division at the International Labour Organization. So we have here 3 of the key institutions in Geneva in charge of trade policy, labour policy, the intersection between trade and the environment. And we've Tessa's invited you today, I think, to respond a little bit to what you've just heard. It's quite a tall order, a long list of things that I've written at the top of my notes. But what we thought it would be interesting to hear from an institutional perspective, what you each see as the core priorities for international cooperation on trade, and what are some of the key opportunities seen from your organization's perspectives to advance this coherence and this kind of cooperation. I'll start with you, Aiko, if you don't mind, and then Miho, and then Mr. Lee.
Right. Thanks very much, Alice. Thanks very much to Dimitri and, of course, Caroline for the invitation to join you. I mean, what more can I add to this conversation? I think you've already heard 6 excellent interventions, providing a very wide scope of thoughts and ideas. Maybe I'll just start with what I was thinking about, which was basically saying the obvious, is that most things start with a conversation, and that happens even at WTO. And that was the challenge, that for a long time, there was no conversation at the WTO, no meaningful conversation on trade, environment, and sustainability. So it's as simple as that, get that conversation going and have a real conversation. And then the next thing that came to my mind is, who should be in the conversation? Who actually needs to talk? And again, this is not rocket science. I mean, as much as I enjoy talking, sometimes my colleagues say I enjoy talking too much. It's not me that needs to do the talking that much. It's basically, again, it's the members, it's the delegations, because as you've heard from the ambassadors around the podium, that's where the critical challenges are. And each one has a very important point of view, and each challenge that they raise is clearly the societal challenges that we must address. And in essence, and as you said as well, Alice, some of that work has already been done because that is the point of the SDGs, is meant to go through all of that and to try to come up with a holistic vision. That is the conversation between, whether you call it UN member states or WTO members, that's the global vision. So that leads to the other question, how does one bring that conversation to the WTO? And of course, I take an optimistic view that that conversation has always been there. It could be stronger, it could be more productive, it could lead to more outcome-oriented discussion, but that's a positive thing. You have that discussion there. But what's happened over the last couple of years, 2-3 years, since I've been in WTO for a long time, I think is in a way quite remarkable because the conversation has really accelerated. I mean, and you're having types of conversations that I would never have imagined one would ever have at the WTO. I mean, give the example of, I think Ambassador Valencia already mentioned about plastics, it's a very non-WTO type conversation in the old school, okay? I'm not saying that it's non-WTO today, but I'm just saying the old school view. This is not really a WTO conversation. Why? Because WTO conversations are typically about lifting trade barriers, disciplining a particularly trade distortive type of action and so forth. But what you have behind plastics is a very different type of conversation. It's about how can trade support an environmental outcome or address an environmental problem, where the tools to address such problems may not be immediately obvious. It's not immediately obvious it's about tariff elimination. Maybe you could argue that there might be tariff elimination of certain plastic substitutes and alternatives, but that's not really at the forefront. At the forefront, it's more about, as this title says, it's about coherence and cooperation of how does the trade system actually support another part of the world system or international system, in this case, addressing plastics pollution. And that's a remarkable conversation to have at the WTO, and great credit to the members who sort of brought this about. And that brings another point of the conversation. It's not just about conversation within WTO, it's conversations outside of WTO. And that's something that the system, and it's not, I think, unique to WTO, it's unique to the whole international system, has difficulty having. They have conversations within, they have difficulty having conversations across and beyond. And again, I think the plastics example gives a very concrete example of how this is now happening, because you have the UN treaty negotiations on plastics, you have the WTO members participating in the dialogue, providing very concrete, I don't know how to call it. I know I'm very wary of what I call things because lots of trade negotiators here, but just call it, they come up with outcomes from their dialogue, which they believe they can help the treaty negotiations. And a lot of this is very technical. And I think that's my last point, is that the conversations have to be very technical because the trade problems and the SDG problems are very technical. And many of the things of the last 2-3 years, including the fish subsidies that you mentioned and ambassadors mentioned, they are very technical and they have to be. But often in our system, our difficulty is that we don't get beyond the politics. We don't get beyond the politics to allow that technical discussion to happen. As a humble secretariat point of view, it would, I think, make a big difference if one could allow the technical discussions to go ahead without prejudging too much the politics of the issue, and then discuss through the politics later whether anything can be achieved or not. But to prevent all discussions because the politics are not sorted out really makes it very hard to have conversations at the level that are needed. So that was it. And the very last thing to my friend Matthew is that I'm sure if we had the budget, the DG would consider.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Aiko. I thought, Mr. Lee, I might come to you next because I'd like to make sure that Miho has the last word. Mr. Lee, you work at the International Labour Organization. How does this all sound to you? Give us your perspective on this debate that sort of the trade policy community is having within itself.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm a bit of stranger to all this discussion, so I'm trying to bring in a bit of the IRA perspective. I think one of the important starting point for us is that despite all good thing about trade, but still the public reaction or reception of trade has not been necessarily positive. There are many reasons for that. I mean, there are technical difficulties with the trade policy itself, but at the same time, the way trade has been undertaken and the benefits of the trade have been distributed between countries, within the country, between groups, may not has been very good. So we see the many actually who may not benefit actually from these benefits. That's actually the whole point. Many ambassadors you mentioned, trade as enabler or the trade as a means to achieve the SDGs. I mean, that's a very important perspective. So when it comes to that issues, probably a decent job is perhaps where ordinary people on the street may experience or even evaluate trade and trade policies. So that's why we try very hard to bring actually the trade issues into the labor market and this agenda. I mean, this kind of difficult situation is very clear. I mean, when it comes to the issue relating to global supply chains, we know there are much hope, but we know that many countries, as a part of the global supply chain, somehow stuck in the middle or bottom layer of the global supply chain without much experience or hope on the economic and social upgrading. So from our perspective, it's very, very important to take a full consideration of this actually improvement impact of the whatever trade policies, whatever trade patterns you're thinking of. And also in doing so, we have to identify the importance of the policy gap. Having listened to you all, I mean, I think I realized very important policy areas for action, which is the ability of policy coherence, not just internationally, also within the countries. I'm saying this because if we really maximize the benefit of trade for the people, then inevitably we have to think about how to link the trade policies with other important policies, which will make sure these trade benefits will eventually goes to the people who need most. So for example, industrial policies. I know it's a very difficult topic at the WTO. Now think about the country who actually graduate to the LCD status and they do not have access to the preferential treatment anymore, but they don't have any industrial or sector strategy to move beyond this. What can we do? So I mean, these kind of questions needs to be discussed internationally and also within the country. So it's, for example, Ministry of Trade needs to work together with other ministries to make sure well, we are doing these trade policies. We need some supporting or coherent policy measures. Because we all talk about the climate changes, etc., as if it may happen automatically, but that's not really the case, as you know very well. So we have to bring together, for example, trade and structural transformation, climate transition. There are so many other transitions we have to do together at the same time. How can you make it happen? Internationally, yes. And what about within the countries? I have to say the same things about the job creation. When it comes to job creation, of course, trade does create new jobs, but these jobs do not necessarily go to the people who need most. So that's why we believe, along with these trade policies, we need to target the policies to support these people in terms of trade, the skills or the training policies and social protection. This is very important elements in our view, particularly the skills policies. I mean, one of the very common complaint and concern we keep hearing in many different countries in particular, we have great opportunity for trade, but all of a sudden we don't find any skilled workers for them. This actually is an indication we are not actually properly train the people for the new job opportunities which may create it through the trade. So it has to happen and happening again and again and again. Why? I wonder, that's probably why, that's probably because when we are designing trade policies, we may not systematically incorporate or reflect those elements, including skills and social protection, as the assorted policy packages for the trade. My last point is probably just something you may have expected. We believe this, like all this, the effort on policies, trade and the others, and policy coherence, all different levels can come together with more work on the human rights, many of you mentioned, and also social dialogue and international labor standard. I think we need to be consistent when we apply the international labor standard in the trade agreement. I mean, we have lots of examples. We're doing much better than before, but still there is room for improvement. And probably some of you may know, we do have the SDG indicators dedicated to that, 8.82, which is about the labor rights. We look at all kind of empirical studies on the impact of this, actually the basic core labor rights on the trade. We couldn't find any negative impacts, any significant magnitude. So which means, as of now, we are convinced that all the trade-related discussion can go well with this any discussion that the labor standards. I stop here. Thank you.
Mr. Lee, that was absolutely fascinating. And credit to Tess for bringing the ILO into this discussion, because trade and labor is not an easy topic to bring up, particularly at the WTO. And you've been talking about, sorry, I'm going to take one of your minutes, Chief Miho, because this is really fascinating, because you were talking about the importance of building the ability to benefit from trade and building and making sure that governments ensure that everyone can benefit from trade. And you've been talking about it in terms of decent work and labor standards, which is absolutely right. But at another level, as a trade policy person, I hear that as building a political constituency for trade. So there's an interesting message, I think, for domestic sort of political scientists there as well. Miho, I wanted to make sure you had the last word, because UNCTAD is the part of the international UN system that is dedicated to trade and development. And you have had an office in New York, you have an office in New York. Can you give us your perspective on this intersection and how far we've come in the trade and SDGs debate?
Thank you. I just want to start thanking Caroline, the partner and our friend, for organizing this fantastic session that gave me also the opportunity to listen to all these leading speakers and thinkers on trade in Geneva and my colleagues here. Yes, you mentioned, Alice, we know each other for many, many years. And you mentioned that how the air and atmosphere approach to SDGs changed in the trade community. You know, in a sense, this is for us, like you said, it's a back to basics. You know, our organization is Trade for Development. And we actually see it's not about what to do with trade, but how to use trade for achieving sustained and sustainable development. So from this perspective, I think I'm repeating some of a very, very good statements and ideas shared already by now. But you mentioned that what are the priorities? One way of looking at it is trade as a means of implementation for sustainable development. And another one is also that, you know, maximizing the power of trade itself, following what you just said. As trade as a means of implementation, at this moment, I'm just echoing everyone, but we are looking at how we can make trade contribute to reduce this planetary crisis of climate change, but not only climate change, pollution and biodiversity loss. Trade, obviously, if you look at the practicality, trade provides the actions on the ground to connect economic activities to the actions that would actively contributing to reducing CO2s. Ocean economy is typically, definitely a very good example on that. And also biodiversity loss. By just looking at changing the framework of the international trade, not looking at from the major exporters' point of view, but looking at from the local producer of the biodiversity goods. Ecuador is extremely a good example of biotrade, paying attention to the sustained commercial gains of the local producers and conserving the product for a long term, and also making sure that this would be sustainably provided to the international market to please the consumers. You know, we have the cycle, we have seen the cycle developed. So it's just about the means of implementation is very much about not doing anything new, but changing the perspective and agreeing on from whose perspective we're going to look at trade. That's the means of implementation side. Now, the power of trade, what we are really looking at, not only now, what we have been looking at, Mr. Lee, is exactly that distribution of gains from trade, not only across countries, but across people and across different economic actors. That's why in UNCTAD, we don't only look at trade, but we have an integral approach of looking at trade, finance, investment, technology, logistics, and all that in an integrated manner. Because that is the way to see that if we want to make sure that the trade plays this actual capacity of the catalytic role, then that integral approach is very important. Then comes to the final point. Now, based on this integral point and listening to everyone, and this is, of course, the trade community, I may be saying something very, very stupid, yes, from now on, but I'd like to ask you, does it have to be that WTO solve all the problems that's linked to trade? I'm talking about the multilateral coherence. You already have multilateral agreements in labor, in environment, in very many parts, and you are the members of those multilateral agreements. So my question, I think the Ambassador Pim Chanok has mentioned that already, that we can actually really look at the comparative advantage of WTO, where WTO is strong at, making the normative framework on certain issue, but you don't have to do it for everything. Let's focus finding out the areas where you are extremely good at. Then another part, we all live in the same multilateral framework. And yes, maybe people from the country who's participating in the different multilateral negotiations may be different ministries, but it's all one country. We could think of some areas how we could increase some of the flexibility within the WTO system. What could be the capacity of WTO to accept other multilateral norms? So that it doesn't necessarily have to undermine the WTO rules, but what could be the flexibility or new innovation, like Ambassador Valencia, you said. For example, the final comment on the, I shouldn't, maybe, but this is very important, this common but differential responsibility. There's no one way of framing it in a WTO, and we do require a lot of discussion on this, but that is somewhere that probably having some kind of innovative approach to that could help WTO contributing to this multilateral framework to achieve sustainable development through trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Miho. And thank you very much indeed, Aiko, and also Mr. Lee. Three very interesting reflections, I think, on the role of each of these organizations and the perspectives that you bring to what you've heard in the room today. I have 60 seconds. Firstly, to thank all of our panelists, ambassadors, excellencies. It's been hugely rich, really interesting. We've covered food security in the long term and the short term, the role of the WTO in fixing short-term issues, but also the extremely important unfinished business, particularly in the Doha round, and the agriculture negotiations there, and the question of what do we bring next. We've talked about the very immediate issues, fisheries subsidies agreements, e-commerce. There's a number of things on the agenda of the upcoming ministerial where we may hopefully see progress towards good outcomes. We've covered the importance of coordination, the importance of thinking about the WTO as an institution in a slightly different way, right? Something that the environment initiatives give us the license to do. And we've talked also, I think, about the agendas that different developing countries see for the WTO and for the trade system. That's been really interesting. We've talked about some things that we don't usually talk about in the context of trade discussions. We've talked about labor. We've talked about SDGs in all of their breadth. We've talked about a new WTO office at the UN, which is an idea I hadn't heard before. We've really covered, I think, the gamut in a very integrated way of what the SDGs require the international community to do. And it's wonderful, in fact, to have Ambassador Patriota, because being one of the architects of that, it'll be interesting to see your leadership in the discussions in the trade community of what that agenda asks of us. So welcome back. My very, very last point, a small plug for my own organization. If you're going to be at the ministerial talking about fisheries subsidies and e-commerce and everything else, if you missed out on a slot at the public forum this week, you can run a side event at our Trade and Sustainability Hub. Applications are open, it costs you nothing, and I've seen the rooms and they're very nice. So if you'd like to run a side event at MC13, have a look at our website. Thank you very much to the Geneva Trade Platform for the opportunity to hear all of these speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure. Carolyn and her family are still very much in our thoughts, and we send her and them all of our best wishes. There's coffee outside for those of you who, like me, haven't had lunch yet. And your very next session starts in half an hour. It's about trade's intersection with health and labor. So two very hot topics. Thank you very much all for joining us, and we'll see you outside. Thank you.